The large medieval crowd had come back to a place they knew all too well. It was the place where the future king of the land would one day be revealed, and the long-suffering kingdom would finally know peace. Time and again, a man would attempt the challenge and fail. The citizens bowed their heads in sadness and shame, much as the men did when they failed the test. A boy in the crowd watched the spectacle. He was neither sad nor afraid. He was bewildered. He asked himself why this was still happening. Without thinking, he walked slowly over to what was jokingly deemed the place of failure. People began whispering to one another and pointing. Some began to laugh. What was a child doing here anyway? But as the boy took his place, the jokes stopped. The voices ceased. As if by magic, their eyes and mouths hung open wide in amazement. The boy gripped the sword with a confident hand, and, with a gentle pull, the future king of Britain freed the sword from the stone. Virtuous Men, a podcast devoted to sharing the lives of men of history, fiction, and today, and the virtues they personify. Over the course of this season, we'll explore the lives of 5 men who each exemplified a crucial virtue of life with not just their words, but their actions. From these men, we hope you will learn that a life of virtue is something you can achieve, no matter the obstacle.
Welcome to Episode 6, The Equality of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, featuring special guest Stephanie Barshevsky, author and professor of history at Clemson University. A virtue is a behavior one conforms to in order to achieve a moral and ethically principled life through action. A virtuous man is one who is well aware of how he falls short, yet chooses not to allow his flaws to define him as he seeks to better himself. Such men show that it is possible to overcome the things that keep us from achieving our destinies. Though each man is flawed and imperfect, it is in the lives of flawed men that we see the possibility for virtue in our own lives. This episode's virtue is equality. Over the years, equality has come to be defined and redefined to fit the current age. To many, it is defined by financial, social, and political opportunity. But the true greatness of this virtue is that it is not concerned with the quality of a man's abilities, social standing, race, wealth, or appearance. Rather, it looks at the quality of his character to see if he is worthy of responsibility, power, and influence. In the eyes of equality, nothing matters more than a man's character and his willingness to protect it from compromise. Equality asks us not only to look at ourselves, but to look at others with the same perspective. It tells us, look not at his power, look at the man. Perhaps the most famous example of equality is found in the legendary tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. In this episode, we will explore the history behind these myths, how this group of men came to reach true equality, and how that equality was tragically lost.
Part 1. The History. Arthur, Lancelot, Guinevere, Merlin, the Holy Grail, the Round Table. These names are as familiar to our modern world as in the world for which they were written. They conjure in our minds visions of noble knights, Edenic kingdoms, courtly love, and the great virtues of honor, chivalry, and heroism. For centuries we have been drawn back to the world of Camelot, the king who ruled it, and the knights who served his kingdom. Though the story is familiar to us all, the reality behind the myth is as intriguing as it is mysterious. Real-world events and numerous writers have all played a role in shaping the myth into what we know today. and help to explain why its unique vision of society continues to endure and inspire.
The Arthurian legend emerges out of this very murky, shadowy period that I think historians used to call the Dark Ages, although that's very unfashionable now to call it that, right? So, but it emerges in a British context out of this period, roughly between, say, 400 and 700 AD, when the Romans depart, right? The Romans don't just up stakes and leave one day, right? It's a gradual process, but we can pinpoint about 400 AD is when the Romans start to depart. And with them goes, Roman systems of governance, Roman systems of order. And, again, without going, down this road of it's the Dark Ages and everything's chaotic and terrible, right? But it's a big change. So it's the transition from the Roman to what we would call the Saxon period. And there is certainly, I think it's safe to say, a little bit of a crisis of order.
With the emergence of the Saxon period, numerous battles were fought and subsequently recorded. In the chronicles of the battles, there are a number of figures who are believed to be the possible figure that inspired the creation of Arthur. One of the most likely candidates was the hero known as Ambrosius Aurelianus, who led a British force against the Saxons in the first historical event connected to Arthur.
He's not mentioned by the kind of big medieval chroniclers, these early medieval chroniclers, so people like Bede and Gildas don't actually mention him. We do get a few mentions in some more obscure Welsh chronicles. He starts to pop up in connection with a specific historical event for the first time, in connection with this battle that takes place around 520 AD called the Battle of Baden Hill. That's between the Celts and the Saxons, right? So the Saxons are moving in from continental Europe, first into southeastern and eastern England. They're then pushing west, right, and then pushing the Celts, in the same process that had already happened with Romans, right, pushing the Celts to the kind of northern and western fringes of the Isle of Britain. And there's this battle around 520, and Arthur on the Celtic side fights in this battle. So he's mentioned by these Welsh chroniclers. And by the 7th century AD, we've got him, he's being mentioned very frequently in Welsh poems and Welsh chronicles as this kind of powerful military leader. So that's kind of the beginning of the legend.
The first recorded person to name Arthur was the 9th century Welsh monk Nennius, who recorded that the hero's name was Arthur in his Historia Bretonum. The text mentions 12 battles that Arthur supposedly fought in, though this was a historical and logistical impossibility. By the writing of Nennius's text, Arthur was a prominent figure among Welsh poets, and the literary groundwork had been laid for one of the most prominent and influential Arthurian authors. He was known as Geoffrey of Monmouth. Little is known of his life, though he is believed to have been born right before 1100 AD near Monmouth, Wales, which he frequently mentions in his writings. In the years between 1129 and 1151, he became a cleric and eventually an ordained priest shortly before his death in 1155. During this time, he wrote the immensely popular work, The History of the Kings of Britain. A mixture of real history and outright fabrication, it provides a fleshed-out telling of Arthur's life and introduces certain key figures in Arthurian legend: Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, the prophet Merlin, and the traitorous nephew Mordred. Though now dismissed as historically unreliable, Geoffrey's work provides a pivotal example of something that had always been, and would always be, present in the telling of the myths: an author's use of the legend as a political tool.
I think very quickly it starts to be shaped to suit, much more specific purposes. So it gets away from whatever that kind of origin point is pretty quickly. The legend becomes something that's, it's a political tool, right? It starts to be used very much, sometimes by, for very specific political purposes. So, for example, in the 12th century, we get Geoffrey of Monmouth, right, the very famous Welsh chronicler, using it basically to kind of endear himself to and to praise the Normans, right? The Normans have come in 1066. They've conquered the Saxons. The Normans are trying to use various cultural means, as it happens typically in these cases, to kind of show that their conquest wasn't just one of brute force, that it was actually, something good and benevolent and justified. And so Geoffrey of Monmouth gets kind of tangled up in this project, and he starts using the Arthurian legend to kind of try to flatter the Normans, kind of comparing Arthur to Norman rulers and things like that. So, I think pretty quickly, it's almost like, I think it was Voltaire, right, who said that thing about, if God didn't exist, that man would have to invent him, and I think Arthur is a little bit of that same thing, right? Geoffrey is definitely picking up the Arthurian legend. He's recognizing the way the wind is blowing, right? He wants to be on the winning side, and he recognizes the Normans are going to win because they usually do. And he wants to make sure that he is on the right side, and so he's picking up the Arthurian legend for that purpose. Yeah, we can't look at Geoffrey at all, I think, as as a chronicle of history, right? That's really not what his famous work is at all. But it's no less interesting for what it is. It tells us a lot about history, even though it's not a very accurate depiction of history, I would say.
After the history of the kings of Britain, King Arthur was firmly established as a legendary figure. The tales eventually made their way across the sea to continental Europe, where they were further developed by writers of other countries, notably Germany and France. One of the most important of these writers was the 12th century French poet and troubadour Chrétien de Troyes. Very little is known about his life, though he was known to have prominent patrons of France's Champagne county. With his 5 King Arthur stories, which some consider to be the precursor of the modern novel, he would go on to be considered the father of Arthurian romance. Chrétien introduced some of the most familiar elements to the legends, especially the figures of Lancelot and Guinevere, and the quest for the Holy Grail. One of the most significant achievements of Chrétien and the other continental European writers is the stories becoming less about politics and more about narrative storytelling. The tales become less about the king himself, and more about the characters that surround him, each with unique traits and character arcs.
Between the 12th and the 15th centuries, right, the Arthurian legend, the main development of the Arthurian legend moves to the European continent, right? So it's not just French, it's also, Wolfram von Eschenbach and those German versions of the legend as well, right? So it's shifting into, and then we definitely get this kind of continental evolution of the legend. It's taking on a different purpose, right? I think, to me, the thing that the French and German versions bring is it's no longer the story of, initially it's a story of a powerful warrior, then it becomes a story of a powerful king. Well, then it becomes a story of a royal court, right? And we start to get the Knights of the Round Table. We start to get this broader introduction of characters into it. So it's not really a story about Arthur himself, and it's not really going to be, right, for the kind of rest of its history. It's interesting that we call it the Arthurian legend, but in many of the famous versions of the story, and I think when we get to the 19th century, right, Tennyson really struggles with this. Is Arthur is not very central to it in a lot of ways. It really is the other characters. I think as you start to depict the royal court, you start to introduce these other characters, then again, it becomes a very different story from just, powerful king. So Arthur starts to kind of recede in importance. And then you start to cast other knights. So, what are you going to do? Well, probably initially you're going to get bad knight and good knight, right? So Lancelot becomes, and that's a natural invention, right? Is the greatest knight ever. He can joust anybody off their horse. I mean, he's, and then, yeah, I think at some point your better writers, like Chrétien, they're going to say, this is getting kind of boring. There's too many perfect people in this story, right? We got to mess this up somehow. Well, what are we going to do, right? Well, I got it. I'm going to introduce something really, really spicy into this, right? And so you start to create the kind of adultery story starts to emerge.
It was also during this time that the poet Wace added other well-known details to the story. Like many of his contemporaries, little is known of his life apart from various biographical details. His most well-known work is the Roman de Brut, which was based largely on Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. Wace is the first known author to not only mention the sword Excalibur by name, but also the first to mention the Round Table, the symbol of equality that many believe to be the most endearing symbol of Arthurian legend. The table would become pivotal to the Arthur stories, with many of them beginning with Arthur and the knights seated before it, demonstrating that no one was higher or lower than the other, not even the king himself. Through the use of narrative structure and the emphasis on other characters, Chrétien and his contemporaries also began to add themes that would eventually become synonymous with Arthurian legend: ideals of chivalry, courtly love, and equality. These authors also added some darker elements to the tale, with episodes of incest, murder, betrayal, and adultery taking prominence in the narrative. Thus, the tale becomes less about a warrior king and more about how a king creates and loses a kingdom that is too good to last forever.
It's not sustainable, and again, it would be a very boring legend if it was, in some ways, right? If it was just a story of, again, perfect king accumulates round table of perfect knights go out and do perfect things, and the kingdom lives happily ever after in a perfect way, right? That's not a great story. I do think it's interesting, though, that the ways that it gets unperfected, like they're pretty nasty, right? I mean, yes, this proves the ultimate undoing, right? It's Arthur sleeps with his half sister and produces, this son who then, comes and topples Arthur from the throne in the end. And that's pretty nasty stuff in a way. So I think we forget sometimes, because the Arthurian legend, it seems kind of sparkly, right? It's this, it is this, wonderful kind of chivalric story, and there's all this nobility in it. And even the Lancelot and Guinevere thing, there's moral agony about it, right? So it doesn't quite, but yeah, the murder part of the story is just flat nasty. It's a really stark ending to this attempt to create and what has been this very this kind of very beautiful society of the Knights of the Round Table.
The addition of these elements and themes were not only used for literary purposes to make the story more interesting and resonant, but to show the reader how one should properly live and behave. It was also during this period that Christianity and all its morals and values became firmly embedded in the myth itself.
They're trying to introduce, these courtly ideals, these chivalric ideals into kind of various mythologies with an idea of trying to basically get, rich people to behave better, right? I mean, they're sort of running around and using force, right? Might is right, to kind of get what they want. And so I think that these continental versions of the legend are trying to introduce codes of behavior into various European elites to try to get them to stop doing that, right? And to behave better, right? To have kind of, abstract codes of chivalry and justice and fairness that will stop them from kind of exercising brute force so blatantly. You're getting these specific Christian elements, and I do think it's part of this process. And we could almost call it the kind of moralization, right, of the Arthurian legend, which again is not really there until these kind of 12th, 13th, 14th century kind of European versions. I think it becomes, more a kind of societal code, and I think the religious aspects of that are, it's something that's almost being, again, in a world where you don't have a lot of enforcement, right, of kind of, again, how, wealthy and powerful people are supposed to behave. So this idea of the kind of looming judgment of God over them becomes another thing to try to get them to behave. So I do think that these overtly Christian elements, which again in some ways I think have kind of dropped back out of the legend a little bit today, but I think they're very, very important really from the Middle Ages, again all the way through to the kind of the end of the 19th century.
The political turmoil of the 15th century would give rise to what is widely regarded as the definitive telling of the Arthurian legend. After emerging from the 100 Years' War, England was thrust into the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. During the fighting, a knight named Thomas Malory was imprisoned multiple times and known to switch allegiances between the warring houses. His identity has never been confirmed, as there were numerous knights with the same name from different regions. In 1470, while supposedly still in prison, he completed the great work known as La Morte d'Arthur, or The Death of Arthur. Like previous Arthurian authors before him, Malory used the myth as a means to comment on the tumultuous time of his age, but was also using it to fulfill his own literary ambitions. It was the first English prose version and full chronological telling of the Arthur legend. Upon its publication, La Morte d'Arthur would be highly influential on all future writers of Arthurian literature.
Malory comes in the 15th century, right? He's essentially frustrated, right? The England in the 15th century is torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, right? So you've got these powerful aristocratic and royal families fighting against each other. It's bloody, right? Civil wars are always very bloody, and the Wars of the Roses are no different. So Malory is very frustrated with that, right? It's not quite an allegory of the Wars of the Roses. I don't think it's that. I don't think you can point to kind of specific characters and say, oh, here's a York and here's a, it's not quite, white rose versus red rose kind of stuff. But I do think that he is painting this picture of a society kind of torn apart by civil strife, and then trying to identify the Arthurian legend as something that can impose order. And I think it takes off. And one, I think it takes off because it's really powerful prose, right? I mean, I think, there's this sort of golden age of English literature that's really going to culminate in Shakespeare, right, a century later. And I think that, the expressiveness of the English language is really coming into force in a big way in this period. And Malory, I think, is very, very powerful. English to me, right, it's not necessarily a pretty language, right? It's not French, it's not Italian, right? But I think when it's at its best, there's a reason why there is so much great, English literature, right? Because I think it's a really powerful language, and I think this is the period when it really starts to come into its own. It's a language that is capable by the 15th century of really packing a punch in a literary context, and I think Malory deploys it very effectively in that way. I mean, I think Le Morte d'Arthur is the most overtly political version of the Arthurian legend in a British context since Geoffrey of Monmouth. But I think it's also that Malory just happens to, in writing about his own frustrations with his own time, he hits on these kind of universal themes of the desire, again, the desire for order, the desire for, a kind of powerful central government, right, that can come in and keep order and, restore order and keep order. I think these are universal themes that Malory, because he is writing in a very specific context, but I think Le Morte d'Arthur really transcends that context. And I think that's why it's much stronger not being like a literal allegory for the Wars of the Roses, but just dealing with these kinds of themes, right, of kind of chaos and order. And I think that, again, is going to be a really, if I had to pick probably a dominant theme in the Arthurian legend from the 15th century onwards, I think it's, it's kind of order versus chaos, right, is really what it's all about.
Malory's work was a bestseller during its time, being reprinted and illustrated numerous times. But eventually, with the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation ushering in shifting cultural interests and changing religious ideals, the Arthur legend fell out of popularity. It was not until the 19th century, with the emergence of Romanticism and a newfound interest in the Middle Ages, that Arthurian literature was revived. One of the central figures in this revival was the poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Tennyson had always been fascinated by the Arthur myths and had long wanted to turn it into something substantial. After a hugely successful career, and coming under the patronage of Queen Victoria herself, he was given the chance. He took the legend and turned it into a 12-book epic poem called Idylls of the King. In addition to taking the myth back to its poetic roots, he was also trying to apply it to the ideals and values of Victorian-era England.
There's been a general revival, really from the late 18th century onwards. I think as Britain starts to become, right, the Britain that is the most powerful, the Britannia that rules the waves, right, the Britain that is the most powerful nation in the world. So, we might time that. We might say the 7 Years' War, which ends in 1763, really kind of cements Britain as, arguably the most powerful nation in Europe, but France is still a rival. And then when they win the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, then there's no argument, right, that Britain is the most powerful nation in the world. And I think along with that goes a search for very specific national stories and national mythologies, right? That I think prior to the end of the 18th century, the British rely a lot on kind of classical mythology, right? They're happy to take stuff from ancient Greece and Rome. Well, I think after the late 18th century, they want their own stories. Tennyson comes along, right, as the greatest author. He's poet laureate. He's the most famous author of his day, really. And he tries to create this kind of Arthurian epic. And he wants to craft this story that that has meaning for people in 19th century Britain, and so you might say, well, okay, the Knights of the Round Table, it's great, right, because they're these sort of knights going out to bring truth and justice and good things to the world, right? So what better metaphor for the British Empire in the 19th century? The problem is, though, that because of the kind of moral failings at the court in Camelot, right, the whole thing falls apart, right? It doesn't work. So I would argue that in Tennyson's case, I don't think it transcends its time very well, right? I think Tennyson is trying to create this kind of moralistic Victorian epic, but the Arthurian legend doesn't work very well for that, right? Because there's some really ugly stuff in it. I mean, Lancelot and Guinevere, it's not. It's hard to do with it to make it into the story that Tennyson wants to shape it into. So I think he really struggles with it. I think it's interesting as a struggle to try to craft it, but I think the Idylls of the King is kind of fatally hampered in the end by its kind of Victorianness. I don't think, like Malory, that it does manage to transcend its own time all that well.
Despite the problem of reconciling the Victorian age with the myths of the past, Idylls of the King was a success. It brought Tennyson further renown and helped re-establish King Arthur as a legendary British hero. The Arthur legends have remained popular ever since, and continue to be adapted to cinema, radio, television, and other works of literature. Nearly 1,000 years of wars, cultural shifts, changing ideals, and ways of life have persisted into our modern age, and yet the tales of Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, and all that they symbolize refuse to be forgotten. Despite the story's tragic arc and moral failings of the characters, the vision it gives us of what society could be when virtue is held in highest esteem will forever draw us back into its timeless world.
Obviously, it's persistent because it's highly adaptable, right? It's a basic story of a great leader, So I think the adaptability. I think again that these themes of kind of order versus chaos, and we, that's something that's not irrelevant, right? Even in modern political context, and then ideal versus reality, right? And I think it just comes back to the sort of those themes over and over again. Everything about the Arthurian legend is really it's really powerful, right? I mean, it's big mythology, right? There's nothing little about it. There's nothing, it's always a big story, and so it's not surprising in some ways that the stuff that happens that brings it all down is big as well. That name lives on. It's this kind of royal ideal, and as much as the legend undermines that in a lot of ways, right? I mean, Arthur isn't a great king, right? He makes some bad decisions. Again, there's the whole incest thing, and then there's the fact that his wife is not faithful to him, right? And so he's not a great king, but we need him to be a great king, right? And I think that's really what we want. But then I think we recognize the sort of impossibility of it, and I think that's another reason why the legend is so powerful. He's always with us. I think there are a few myths that are more enduring, right? And more more sustainable, more adaptable, more that just keep evolving in really interesting ways.
Part 2. The Myth.
Now let us speak of those who once were, and leave aside those who still are. So it is my pleasure to relate a story worth listening to, about the king whose fame spreads near and far. And I do agree with the belief of so many Britons that his renown will last forever. Thanks to him, people will recall his chosen knights, fine men who strove for honor. Chrétien de Troyes.
In the land of ancient Britain, there dwelt a powerful king named Uther Pendragon. Though he was a beloved king, he held within his heart a forbidden passion. He had fallen in love with Igraine, wife of the Duke of Tintagel. Overcome with lust, he pleaded with the wizard Merlin to aid him in his conquest. Merlin agreed, but with only one condition. Any child conceived of the union would be taken immediately into his care. Uther agreed, and Merlin used his magic to disguise him as the Duke of Tintagel. He found her in the Duke's castle and consummated his heathen desire. The real Duke was killed in a battle between his and Uther's armies, and Uther took Igraine as his wife. 9 months later, a baby boy was born. Merlin came and took the child away to be raised by another lord.
Then when the lady was delivered, the king commanded 2 knights and 2 ladies to take the child, bound in a cloth of gold. So the child was delivered unto Merlin, and so he bare it forth unto Sir Ector, and made a holy man christen him, and named him Arthur. Sir Thomas Malory.
Shortly after Arthur's birth, Uther Pendragon died of illness. No one knew he had a son, and very soon, conflict erupted between the nobles, dukes, and lords over who would claim the throne. Merlin was once again called upon to find a solution. He placed a stone in the church courtyard, on top of which he placed an anvil. Stuck in the anvil was a majestic sword. Merlin, knowing Arthur was safe, declared that whoever could pull the sword from the stone would be the rightful king of Britain. Though many tried over a period of years, all who attempted the feat failed. With each failure, the kingdom further fell into decay and ruin. Meanwhile, Arthur grew up with his foster brother Kay, never knowing the circumstances of his birth, meeting his true parents, or knowing he was really the son of a king. He met and befriended Merlin at a young age, and Merlin instructed and mentored the youth in all aspects of life. Merlin brought Kay and Arthur to the sword and the stone. A large crowd had assembled, expecting to see what they had seen hundreds of times before. Kay approached the sword and predictably failed to free the weapon. It was Arthur's turn. The crowd fell silent. He slowly approached what was to become the beginning of his destiny.
There was seen in the churchyard, against the high altar, a great stone, and in the middle thereof was like an anvil of steel a foot on high, and therein struck a fair sword, naked by the point. And letters there were written in gold about the sword that said thus, Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is rightwise King of all England. Sir Thomas Malory.
Arthur grasped the hilt and, with a trembling hand, freed the sword from the stone. The crowd stared in amazement and broke out in loud cheers and applause. Arthur held the sword aloft in the same amazement, realizing for the first time who he truly was and what lay before him. Arthur was crowned High King of Britain and set his kingdom in the land of Camelot. To emphasize his position and authority, Merlin determined that he needed a symbol. He took Arthur to a lake, and they waited. In the middle of the lake, the misty waters began to stir. The ripples came closer to shore, and from the water emerged the mythical enchantress Nimue, the Lady of the Lake. In her hand she held the most magnificent sword Arthur had ever seen. It was called Excalibur, and it would be the symbol that would forever define his place as king. One night, a woman came to his castle seeking shelter from the bitter cold. Arthur, seeing that she was beautiful and in need, allowed her inside. Though he did not learn her name, he was captivated and impassioned. He stayed with her for the night, and by the next morning, the woman had gone. Eventually, Arthur forgot her, not knowing that she was his half-sister, the evil sorceress Morgan Le Fay. Without Arthur's knowledge, she gave birth to the one who would one day betray him. His name was Mordred, and as he grew, so too did the evil within him. Though Arthur was now king, he saw that he was alone. He had no queen to help him rule and to bear him children. One night, Arthur spent the night at another castle, and as he lay sleeping, he was awoken by the sound of music. He followed it to another room, where he saw a maiden seated alone and playing a harp. Her name was Guinevere. Never before had he seen a woman so fair and so beautiful. Never had his desire and longing for a woman been so strong. He loved her at once. Merlin warned him that marrying her would bring him and his kingdom nothing but misery and misfortune. Arthur ignored his words and chose her to be his queen. Soon after his marriage, the knights in King Arthur's court began to grow increasingly competitive and jealous of one another. To prevent chaos from tearing his court apart, his father-in-law gave him a gift. It was a giant round table with the names of the knights inscribed on the various seats. Though all had different skills and abilities, no one would be higher or lower than the other, not even the king himself. From that day on, all would be viewed and treated as equals. But one seat remained vacant. It was the seat reserved for the most perfect of all knights, and any who tried to sit upon it would perish.
In our great hall there stood a vacant chair, fashioned by Merlin ere he passed away, and carven with strange figures, and in and out the figures, like a serpent, ran a scroll, of letters in a tongue no man could read, and Merlin called it the Siege Perilous, perilous for good or ill, for there, he said, no man could sit but he should lose himself. Alfred Lord Tennyson.
Arthur's kingdom of Camelot was now firmly established. For many peaceful years he ruled with Guinevere by his side, and his knights enacted noble deeds to ensure that peace remained. All was equal, fair, and good. Knights from all over came to join the Round Table. One of these was a dashing French knight named Lancelot du Lac. He was a most handsome man, and his skills in combat were said to be legendary. Lancelot asked to be the Queen's protector and defender. Queen Guinevere and Lancelot were immediately stricken with one another. After accepting his offer, the two of them fell in love and began an affair, often slipping away into the woods under the cover of darkness.
He adored her and knelt down before her. In no saint's relics did he place such faith. The queen held out her arms to him, embraced him, and hugged him to her breast. It was love that made her give him such a joyous welcome. If her love for him was great, his for her was 100,000 times more so. For in all other hearts, love is absent in comparison with love's presence in his. So completely did love establish himself again in his heart, that for all other hearts he left little. Chrétien de Troyes.
Arthur was unaware of their trysts, and he remained Lancelot's close friend. Lancelot rose in prominence in the court, and was widely viewed as the best knight at the Round Table. But his standing would soon be challenged. Lancelot was taken to a nunnery to knight a young man, who some noted looked similar to Lancelot. It was Galahad, his illegitimate son by another woman. The next day, when Galahad was brought to the Round Table, he learned that he was the one destined to find the Holy Grail. He boldly took his place in the Siege Perilous, and a vision of the Grail appeared in the middle of the Round Table. It was a sign from above that it was time to begin the quest to achieve the Grail, and to in turn see the greatest knight revealed. Over the course of many adventures and dangers, the knights sought the Grail. Many returned in defeat or strayed from the quest along the way, until only Galahad, Percival, and Bors were left. They eventually found King Pelles in Corbenic, and only Galahad was deemed worthy of beholding the Grail. When he saw it, he was immediately swept up in a trance, beholding visions of wonders and glories too great for mortal man. After seeing the Grail, Galahad perished, knowing nothing on earth could ever hope to satisfy. Sir Percival chose to become a hermit, and only Sir Bors returned to Camelot to tell what had happened. With Galahad gone, Lancelot's status as Arthur's best knight was returned, but this was not to last. Arthur finally discovered Guinevere's affair with his friend, and fell into despair. Lancelot rode away, but Guinevere remained to be taken to court. When she was found guilty of adultery, she was sentenced to be burned at the stake. But before the torches were lit, Lancelot returned, and, after killing some of Arthur's knights, rescued his lover and rode away. Arthur was furious. After placing Mordred in charge of Camelot, he rode with an army to find Lancelot and Guinevere. After long months of sieges and negotiations, Lancelot was banished to France, and Guinevere was taken back to Arthur. But when Arthur returned to Camelot, the worst had happened. The power-hungry Mordred had declared himself High King of all Britain. Both of the men's armies met, and a great battle soon raged. Though many were slain on both sides, Arthur and Mordred remained. Arthur saw an opening and picked up a spear. Mordred saw him charge and swung his sword in a mighty arc. The spear impaled Mordred's black heart, and the sword cleaved Arthur's skull in a deadly blow. Though Mordred had finally been vanquished, Arthur lay mortally wounded on the field of battle. As he lay dying, he was taken to the lake from where he had received his great sword Excalibur. The blade was returned to the Lady of the Lake, never to be used by another. As Arthur moved closer and closer to death, 3 figures seated on a boat emerged from the mist.
Then saw they how there hove a dusky barge, dark as a funeral scarf from stem to stern. Beneath them, and descending they were ware, that all the decks were dense with stately forms, black-stoled, black-hooded, like a dream. By these 3 queens with crowns of gold, and from them rose a cry that shivered to the tingling stars, and, as it were one voice, an agony of lamentation, like a wind that shrills all night in a wasteland, where no one comes or hath come since the making of the world. Alfred Lord Tennyson.
The 3 queens took Arthur and rode back into the mist, bound for the mysterious Isle of Avalon. Lancelot ended his days as a holy man, forever bound to his shame. Guinevere went into a nunnery and lived the rest of her days in quiet sorrow. The once great kingdom of Camelot was gone, but it is said to this day that the great King Arthur is not dead, but merely asleep. And when the kingdom of Britain needs a savior, he will rise again to usher in a golden age. Perhaps once again he will rebuild the glorious kingdom he once lost, a kingdom where love, chivalry, nobility, and equality once again rule the day. A kingdom in which a man is not judged by his might, his strength, or his social standing, but by the quality of his character. And thus begins the tale of old, of warriors true to thy one pure soul, of kingdom ordained like Eden on earth, ruled by king of noble birth, of queen so noble, fair, and light, who sold her soul for love so bright. A time of old that could have been, when Arthur King returns again.
This episode of Virtuous Man was written and recorded by Scott Einig and edited by Jamie Adams. Additional voices by Stephanie Einig and Jamie Adams. A very special thanks to author and professor Stephanie Barshevsky. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a rating and leave a review in the comments section. And don't forget to check out more Virtuous Man on our Instagram page at virtuous_man and give us a follow. Tune in next week for the Season 3 finale, Loose and Unscripted, where we go behind the scenes and discuss the making of Season 3.